Hello everyone, I'm Mike Ward and welcome to Conversations in Healthcare, a video series brought to you by DRG, part of Clarivate. Currently we're focusing on the COVID-19 pandemic and the numerous challenges it has unleashed on the healthcare industry, and we're looking at how business leaders in the sector are managing them. In line with this, I'm delighted to be joined by Bill Newell. Bill has since 2009 been the CEO of Sutro Biopharma, a publicly quoted clinical stage biopharma company headquartered in South San Francisco, California. Underpinned by a platform technology, the company is discovering, developing, and manufacturing therapeutics based on antibody conjugates, bispecific antibodies, and cytokine derivatives. And it's targeting cancer and autoimmune diseases. It has 3 programs in phase 1, 2 of which are internal, while a third is partnered with Bristol Myers Squibb. So Bill, I hope you and those you care about are keeping safe and well, and thanks very much for joining me.
Good day, Mike, and thank you for having me on. And yes, everyone is doing well in our household, so mercifully.
Great. That's good to know. So first, let's sort of talk about COVID-19 and what have been the immediate or the most immediate impacts of the pandemic on the company and its employees.
Well, of course, like many companies, when we were asked to shelter in place or shelter at home, the company was highly compliant in that regard, and we reduced our presence on site, although employees continued to work. But we are a different company in the sense that not only are we running several cancer trials, but we actually manufacture the drug for those cancer trials. And so one of the worst things that can happen to a cancer patient is to be told that there is no more drug available because you've stopped your production facilities. And so early on, we made the decision that we needed to continue to operate our manufacturing facility in as normal a manner as we could. Obviously, we needed to change the way in which we brought people on site and the way they did their activities, which would have been without masks and in close proximity to one another in order to be able to safeguard the health of our employees, but we continued to manufacture. From a research perspective, we had some very critical late stage programs that are on their way to the clinic. In fact, our partner EMD Serono announced a bispecific antibody drug conjugate at a scientific conference quite recently that we have produced and that is going to go into clinical trials in the first quarter of next year. So that obviously is a high priority program. Principally, these drugs are available initially to patients who have no other therapeutic option for them. They would likely be going to hospice. And so being able to give them an opportunity to have an extended life is something that's highly important. So we've managed to work through the pandemic, but not nearly at the levels that we were at before. And that's been important to safeguard our employee population.
So we have seen the sort of restrictions on movement and lockdowns has impacted both the conducting of existing clinical trials and the initiation of new ones. So in your experience, you've still been able to keep those running, and you're still on track to initiate new trials.
Absolutely, Mike. It's really of fundamental importance to the cancer patients that they get their treatment on a regularly scheduled basis. And I think we've been quite fortunate in that the trial sites that we have initiated for the existing trials are not, by and large, in the areas that were hotspots for the pandemic. So we did not have a lot of sites in New York or a lot of sites in Boston or in Chicago or in Los Angeles. And so in areas in the United States where the pandemic is less virulent, if you will, at this stage, there are fewer cases and it's not rising as quickly. Hospital resources aren't as constrained. What you see is that actually cancer centers are trying to continue with business as usual because they are providing essential medical care to very sick patients. And so in the main, we've had to adjust a little bit of the way that the trials are done, labs are not always taken at the investigator's site. Maybe they're taken at a local lab site, and then the information is transferred to the investigator. But we've been able to move along relatively with relative little impact for our cancer trials. And our partner, EMD Serono, hasn't had any difficulty getting into the final stages of preparing to start their phase 1 trial in the first quarter of next year.
Right, and you mentioned the fact that you have manufacturing. So have there been any sort of significant significant changes in work practice at that facility?
Well, I'll tell you, there's a lot more acrylic around. If I'd known, I would have invested in the people who make plastic barriers between, cubicles. So that's been kind of the biggest physical change in a manufacturing facility, particularly a GMP manufacturing facility, which this one is. Workers gown up separately. They wear eyewear. They wear masks. That's part of the routine process of manufacturing. We did have to adjust work schedules a little bit because we didn't want, and fortunately, as of this date, no one in our company has tested positive. We didn't want a whole shift to be quarantined at home because of an individual testing positive for the virus. And so as a consequence, we changed some of the work practices where we could. Now, there are certain practices where it's not safe to have an individual in a room by him or herself. And so as a consequence, we would end up putting in some special gowning protections or special mask protections in those instances. But other than trying to separate the workers to give them their own space as much as possible, we've been pretty much able to keep that manufacturing facility on track without losing a beat.
Right. Now, one of the other things is you guys recently were successful in raising sort of $98 million in a public offering. So given travel restrictions or social distancing, the ability to actually meet face to face, what were the challenges associated with that fundraising, and what was it that you did that actually ensured that you were able to sort of execute the sort of the financing plan?
It was a really unusual financing for our company and any company raising capital these days. The typical way we would have done it is we would be on airplanes. We would be to the major investment centers in the United States, and we'd be talking to investors around the world. And that would be a very concentrated effort over a handful of days in order to really feel like there was investment interest in the follow-on offering that we did. So in the absence of being able to do that, we scheduled a number of Zoom calls just like this, and it was back to back to back. And that's really allowed us to at least uh, get in front of the investors in a personal way, even if it's not in the same room, and go over the data that we've generated and what the company's plans are for the next year to 2 year period. And that was, at one level, it was more efficient because I think we made many more Zoom calls than we could have made in-person visits. At another level, it was not really as robust because it's harder for me, I think, to get the sense of where an investor sees opportunity or has questions from a Zoom video. If I'm sitting across the table, I can notice a lot of body language. When I'm talking to them on Zoom, I'm actually concentrating more on making certain that I'm coming across than being able to actually get a sense of how they're interacting to my messaging. So a little bit of a challenge, but we were supported by our investment bankers and we were prepared with the material that we wanted to share with investors, and it worked out extremely well for the company. So I was delighted that, surprised a little bit that we could raise capital in this environment, but delighted that we were able to put enough money in the bank so that the company is financed into 2022.
Yeah. Now, oncology and immuno-oncology in particular is a very, very competitive space at the moment. Particularly we see a lot of companies sort of raising money. There's a lot of companies developing programs, etc. How does a company like Sutro Biopharma ensure that it's going to sort of have share of voice? As the CEO, what are your challenges around that?
It's interesting. Some of the programs that we are working on are areas where it is a very, very crowded clinical and commercial environment. I'm going to talk for a moment about our BCMA antibody drug conjugate program, which is partnered with Bristol Myers Squibb. BCMA, B cell maturation antigen, is a very important multiple myeloma target. And many in the industry believe that after available therapies are no longer working for a patient, that a BCMA targeted therapy is the right way to go. And there are multiple approaches to it. There are CAR T therapies, there are bispecific therapies, and there are antibody drug conjugates, and we happen to have one of those. And that's partnered with Bristol Myers Squibb. And I think what's important for us in that space is that we are partnered with Bristol Myers Squibb. They are, by virtue of their acquisition of Celgene, one of the leading companies, if not the leading company, treating multiple myeloma with a variety of different therapeutic approaches and a variety of different BCMA modalities. And so, by virtue of our partnership with them, our share of voice, if you will, is elevated because they are in the dialogue as the company that is really at the forefront of BCMA therapy in terms of the breadth of their modalities. Now, I take a different approach with some of our proprietary programs. Our folate receptor alpha antibody drug conjugate for ovarian and endometrial cancer is really an interesting program. It's one that we own and that we have in the clinic right now. And what we really try to do in that case is make sure that the ovarian cancer doctors are very cognizant of our therapy, of what the data has shown, and what the opportunities are for entering their patients in clinical trials. So we're not yet at a full-blown battle the way that Bristol is with BCMA, because there are many companies that are developing BCMA targeted therapies. There's only one other company that is in the clinic with a folate receptor alpha antibody drug conjugate. So that's a slightly different opportunity. And really, we're trying to make certain that the cancer specialists who would actually have patients for our trial understand the potential and want to enroll their patients in our existing trial or in future trials. So kind of two different worlds. And in the ones that are highly competitive for mind share, by and large, we are partnered with large pharmaceutical companies, and they do the heavy lifting in that rather than us having to do so.
So it's interesting that you should talk about the BCMA program, because that is, well, it's now partnered with Bristol Myers, but it was originally part of a deal that you established back in 2014 with Celgene. I was just wondering, what did you and your management team have to do when you first heard that Bristol Myers was actually going to acquire Celgene? When the original deal was signed, was there some sort of contingency clauses in place should Celgene be acquired?
Well, no one really expects that one of your major partners, a big biopharmaceutical company, is actually going to be acquired by another one. And so um, we had to deal very quickly with the situation. And the first thing that I wanted to understand before even looking at the contract is uh, is the team that is responsible for developing our BCMA ADC going to be the same team that is going to be taking it forward into later stages of clinical development? Because if that's not the case, then the people who know the drug best and the people who've been planning the clinical trial strategy are no longer there to support the drug, and you have to educate a whole new group of people. And we were fortunate in the fact that we learned very early on that that team was in fact going to continue in Bristol Myers Squibb. So there was no disruption of the clinical trial strategy or the clinical trial execution. And so once we understood that that was the case, then the other challenge for us was really to make certain that we were continuing to have the good working relationship with the new entity that we had enjoyed with Celgene. You referenced that the agreement was signed in 2014, and so that's 5 years of building relationships, and many of those relationships were going to disappear. Not the clinical trial one, but many of the other ones were going to disappear. And so, as soon as we could understand what the new structure of the organization was going to be and who was replacing the individuals who we had built relationships with, we started the process of reaching out to rebuild or to build anew relationships with people within Bristol Myers Squibb. And that to me is in many ways more important than an agreement, because when you have a relationship, you can then talk through any challenges that arise in that relationship and arrive at a good and sound business decision. And so I think we've been very successful in doing that. It's helped by the fact that, as I said, a number of the Celgene people, including their clinical development team, stayed on as part of the Bristol organization. But we've been able to build new relationships, and I don't think we've really missed a beat as a consequence of that. So, frankly, I never had to go back and look at the agreement. It wasn't something that we had contemplated happening, but we were able to manage through it. And I find our relationship with Bristol to be very solid at this point in time.
One of the other things that you refer to is the fact that you actually have sort of manufacturing capacity to sort of manufacture your own products for certainly for the clinical trials. This is many biotechs aren't actually in that position. I was just sort of wondering, could you sort of explain the sort of the rationale behind the decision to have your own capacity in the first place, and what were the sort of difficult questions that you got from your own investors when you told them that this was a route you were going to take?
Well, it was really a very important strategic decision for our company to go into manufacturing and do so at an early stage. You alluded to this earlier, Mike. We make molecules in a way that's very different from the normal large biopharmaceutical company. We don't use cells per se as the factory for making those molecules. We actually take the machinery that is inside the cell and extract it from the cell. And that is then, we call it an extract. That is something that we then use to do protein synthesis. Instead of a living organism making our molecule, the machinery becomes a tool for a biochemical synthesis, and that is fundamentally different than any other approach to making these sorts of molecules that we're talking about. And so as the company was developing, we knew we had to be able to do two things in order to be successful from a manufacturing standpoint. We needed to be able to scale the production so that what we could do at the lab bench was something that could be done at much larger scale in a GMP manufacturing facility. So that was challenge number one, and we worked to successfully do that. And then number two, we needed to be able to show that we could actually make a therapeutic. And in order to do that, not only did we have to discover it, but then we had to make it in a facility. And ordinarily, if you go to a third-party contract manufacturing facility, they're all set up to take a CHO cell line or an E. coli cell line and make the molecule that you are interested in having them make. But in our case, none of the facilities around the world are set up to use our process. So we would have had to have paid someone else to establish a capability that didn't exist before and that we would be the only customer for. And so we were quite fortunate to be able to find a facility reasonably near our research facilities that was ideally suited for us. And so I think the thing that was most surprising to investors at the time was that we established this facility well before we had a molecule that needed to be made in the facility. Most facilities are there, you go and you tell them what you want them to do, and then they use their machinery to make your molecule. For us, we had to build the facility, outfit it, without knowing what our first molecule was going to be. Now, we've successfully put 3 programs through that facility, and they're in the clinic today, and a 4th has been manufactured and will be in the clinic in the first quarter of next year. And so by being able to invest in our own facility, we were able to get more efficiencies in terms of the manufacturing activities that we had. And we were also in a position to not have to worry about competing for manufacturing slots with other companies. The only manufacturing slots in that facility are those for us and for our partners. And so from that standpoint, it was a really solid strategic decision, albeit a little bit risky, because what if we didn't have a drug that the manufacturing facility would make? But we felt confident that they were on their way, and so investing in that manufacturing facility actually paved the way for us to start clinical development much faster than would have been the case, and in a much more cost-effective manner than would have been the case.
Now, I mean, you have a proprietary technology platform. I mean, it's been licensed to Vaxcyte. It used to be called Sutro for the production of vaccines. In your business plans, is there any sort of your suggestion that you may actually sort of license that technology so other people can use the same platform to manufacture their own molecules, or is it something that you're actually going to keep in house?
Well, we thought quite a lot about that question, and we did, you're right, license our technology platform for the production of prophylactic vaccines to what's now called Vaxcyte. It was Sutrovax, and they've been very successful in an initial public offering recently, and they're using our technology to produce probably the leading next generation pneumococcal conjugate vaccine, which will have broader protection than anything on the market or anything that is under development in the big pharmaceutical vaccine world that exists today. So a really nice application of our technology in an area that we weren't frankly going to invest the time and energy and resources to take full advantage of the rest of the technology. But in the main, the business model for the company is one in which our extract is a crown jewel. It is something that no one else in the world has access to. It gives us a competitive advantage in terms, and our partners a competitive advantage as well, in terms of our ability to make many different complicated molecules rapidly, to test and screen them, to start to understand in a way that no one else can structure activity relationship, so that we can optimize each of these molecules to be the best available therapeutic that we can engineer. And that's something that it just frankly, even the big companies don't have the ability to do within the time frame that we do, or even if they had a longer time frame, they don't have the scale to be able to do it. It's really, as I said, it's a crown jewel, and we treat it as such, and that's why we've been able to achieve very high value collaborations with Bristol Myers Squibb, with Merck, and with EMD Serono. And so I think from our perspective, I think of that technology advantage we have the way that Coca-Cola thinks about Coke syrup. If you want a Coke and you don't have Coke syrup, no bottling plant can make you a Coke. But if you have Coke syrup, you can ship it to any other bottling plant in the world and they can make you a Coca-Cola. So it's that essence, that secret that they guard very carefully, that is one of the keys to their great success as a business. And we treat our extract the same way that they treat their Coke syrup recipe. It's highly proprietary, and if we gave it away, then there would be no reason for people to have to work with us.
So, looking at the business model, what are your ambitions? I mean, do you have plans to become a sort of fully commercial company where you have your own sales force?
I think it's been a long time since small biotech companies aspired to doing that. It seems that it's much easier to take something to a certain point in time and then get sold or license the asset off to somebody else and let them go the rest of the journey. I think for us, we have a passion for cancer and for next generation cancer therapeutics. And I think we've got something special going on at Sutro. We have 2 drugs that are wholly owned in the clinic. We are working on a third program that I hope to be able to talk about at the end of this year or early next year, and many more behind that, in addition to the programs we have in collaboration with our partners. And so I think we have the broad base of technology, the broad base of therapeutic approaches, the broad base of opportunities to treat cancer patients that is really unique and gives us every opportunity to become a fully integrated biopharmaceutical company. So do I have that as part of our vision? Yes, that is clearly part of our vision downstream, and we need our cancer therapeutics to be more mature in terms of where they are in stages of development before we start actually investing in building the commercial infrastructure that will ultimately be necessary in order to achieve that vision. But absolutely, I think we have what it takes, and it's a matter of time in my mind before we actually take those steps towards fulfilling the opportunity to be a fully integrated biopharmaceutical company. So stay tuned. It's not right now around the corner, but it is in the midterm horizon, and that's certainly something that we aspire to at this point in time.
Yeah, sure. Because I mean, for many biotechs, they kind of realize that to build critical mass, actually holding on to your assets and then being able to sell them yourselves is one way of building a company. I mean, if one looks at it, Sutro Biopharma, you've got a market cap of around $280 million at the moment. What do you what do you need to do to grow that into a much larger company?
I think you've put your finger on it. Right now, we have capital that takes us into 2022. We have a series of data releases that we anticipate both later this year and in 2021, where we actually think investors will come to understand that the promise of our technology platform is actually being borne out in clinical trial results. Now, we're very optimistic about the early data that we've seen, but let's be honest, it's early data, it's in dose escalation, and patients in our trials have not been on the drug for as long as you would hope in order to understand the true therapeutic value and the true safety of the drugs that we put in the clinic. And so for us, we see those clinical trials maturing, and as they mature, if the early data continues to hold up, we think investors will come to appreciate that we have designed molecules that have single agent activity and that are on the path to being a best-in-class therapeutic for cancer patients. Now, once that is recognized, and I say we're 6-ish, maybe 12 months away from having that data, I think our market cap will change. I think it will go up significantly, and that will provide us with additional financing opportunities to continue the journey to building a fully integrated biopharmaceutical company. Really, right now, we are in the blocking and tackling stages of doing clinical development, of treating patients, of seeing how they do on our therapy, and then reporting that back out. So stay tuned over the next 6 to 12 months, because that'll be a time where we have significant data that really underpins our belief in these molecules.
So finally, you've been at the company now for a decade, or just over a decade. What are the sort of the business, or what are the biggest leadership challenges that you're currently facing, and what are you doing to address them?
If we weren't in the pandemic, I'd have given you a completely different answer to that question. I'd have talked about the importance of making good investment decisions in the third and fourth programs that we're going to put in the clinic, the importance of selecting yet another partner beyond Bristol and Merck and EMD Serono, because I do think it's important for us to have additional partnerships, and we are continuing to maintain dialogue even during the pandemic with a number of those companies. But to me, I think the biggest challenge right now is ensuring that our workforce continues to be as productive as they have been for the whole time that I've been privileged to lead Sutro Biopharma. We have probably 40% of our researchers able to come into our office today, and they don't come into the office or into the labs for the same amount of time that they would have. And so they are doing a lot of work virtually, if you will, from home. But the ability to actually be in the lab, to run the experiments, to get the results, to inform your next experiment is just not as robust as it has been. And so for me, what we try to think about is, and even as this pandemic seems to be growing again in the United States, how do we keep the business of the company moving forward so that we can continue to develop new therapies for cancer patients who are at the end of their therapeutic options? And how do we do that in a way that keeps our workers safe? As I said, there's lots of acrylic. Everyone wears masks whenever they're in the facility. There is an incredible amount of cleaning, and in the evenings, deep cleaning of areas that have been used by our staff. But even with all of that, and some shift work going on and a few other things, even with all of that, we're still only able to bring about 40% of our research workforce back on site and into the labs. And so the biggest challenge for me is trying to figure out how we can remain as productive as possible. Instead of doing, we have a great luxury with our technology. We can do hundreds of experiments simultaneously. Now, because we're not in the lab as much, even though we can do hundreds, we actually have to focus in on what are the ones that are most likely to be critical to advancing a program and do those. Now, we may do many different iterations of those, but we're just not doing the breadth of research that we did before because we don't have people on site to be able to do that. So one of our advantages of being able to kind of overwhelm, if you will, research by doing experiment after experiment more so than anybody else is a little bit constrained. And so trying to figure out how to get more people back in the labs, and they want to come back on site. They know the work that they do is important for cancer patients. Figuring that out and maintaining their safety is a really significant challenge. And I'm fortunate that I'm advised by our chief medical officer and a multifunctional team within our company, and we are doing it in a stepwise fashion. And so, I hope that even though the pandemic is far from over, we're finding ways to bring more people back to maintain that high degree of productivity, but also to keep people safe. And as I said, fortunately, as of today, no one in our company has tested positive for the virus, and I want to keep that track record going forward as long as we can.
I mean, obviously that sounds like a great target to have. Just to come on that thing about the fact that you're sort of saying, right, okay, so before you're running, many tests or experiments in parallel, now you're maybe doing it on fewer sort of candidate options, etc. What does that mean in terms of sort of like sort of the due diligence rigor? Does that mean actually there are you're able to spend a lot more time in that sort of that selection process? Because I guess there's nothing worse than not necessarily you can put through a program and it doesn't work, but the worst thing is probably to dump a program that actually could have worked. So that false negative. So I just wondered, does this mean that there is sort of more rigor in terms of testing the opportunities that you might look at?
I think we're doing it a little bit differently. In the past, when we had an idea, we would throw everything we could at that idea because we could do that. And my CSO is fond of saying that we'll make many different molecules, even ones that probably don't make any sense to make, because we can do that. And it's not burdensome, it's not costly, and sometimes you get surprised. But now that people aren't in the labs as much and don't have that ability, as I said, to overwhelm the science, if you will, by just doing multiple different experiments, people are, when they're back in their home offices or home workspaces, they're actually digging deeper into the literature to understand at a level that they weren't able to get to because they didn't have the time available. And we had a technology that meant we could overwhelm an area, even if we didn't fully understand why what we were making works. So it's a much more concentrated effort to really sharpen the pencil a little bit and then go back and do, again, you can do multiple experiments when you're in the lab, but do the ones that have an even sharper focus based on the additional time you've been able to spend understanding the biology, understanding the target, thinking about the various parameters that you might want to do. So, from that sense, I think the science is at one level better, But I think what we lose, and that's why I'd like to get everybody back, is that serendipity that happens when you make something that probably didn't make sense based on what is known, but actually makes sense in the end because we didn't have perfect knowledge. And by making something different, we've actually created a therapeutic that no one would have conceived of before. That's part of the excitement of our platform technology, and I look forward to the day when we can do that all the time.
Yeah, so good. So Bill, thanks so much for taking the time to talk to me today. Yeah, the insights that you've shared are definitely going to resonate with many in our audience. So if after listening to this broadcast, you'd like to tune into future conversations in health, follow our LinkedIn page, where we'll be posting alerts to future episode releases. So in closing, I'd like to thank Bill again for joining me, and thank you, our listeners, for tuning in. So until next time, stay safe and healthy. And I'm Mike Ward, and I'll see you in the next episode.